Thank you to everybody for being here. Thank you to our panelists for being here. We have a really exciting webinar today. We're talking about not just talking about only, but we're talking about a report that the Bipartisan Policy Center and the Elections Group put together on election professional training, training for election officials, a 50-state analysis. Joining us today to have that conversation is Grace Kleinfelter, a project analyst or research analyst. Grace, I'm sorry, the run of show has your old title. At the Bipartisan Policy Center, we have Isaac Kramer, who's the executive director of the Charleston County, South Carolina Board of Registration and Elections. And then we have Mitchell Brown, Dr. Mitchell Brown, who's a political science professor at Auburn University and the director of Auburn University's Election Administration Initiative. We're going to jump right in. I'll give folks a second to introduce themselves beyond that, and then we'll go ahead and get started with Grace's presentation. So we'll start with intros on Mitchell.
Sure. So thanks for having me so much. Training is near and dear to my heart, so I'm excited to be here. We also serve as a curricular faculty for the Election Center CERA certification program. And this is what I feel like I do all day, every day.
All right, go to Isaac.
Yeah, I'm not just the director of elections in Charleston. I also serve as the president of our state association for election officials. We have a really awesome acronym in SCARE, and I'm hoping we get to change that one day where legislators are not poking fun at our name. So I'm also serve on the board of advisors for the EAC. I'm on the multiple BPC work task force for election officials and elections and looking at training programs. So very excited about this report and appreciate you inviting me to be on the panel.
All right, we'll turn it over to Grace. And Grace, if you want to jump right into your presentation from there, that'd be excellent.
Absolutely. Great to have y'all on. I've spent the last year and change thinking about training for election officials day and night sometimes. So huge thank you to both Mitchell and Isaac, who were just instrumental in this project. Thank you to the elections group. Y'all are amazing. And thank you to every election official who I called in the middle of an election year to say, can you talk to me about this really nerdy subject? So huge shout out to all of y'all for taking the time. And we're going to jump right into our presentation. TJ, you're going to have to tell me if this is working.
That looks good to me, Grace.
Fantastic. All right. So hello, everybody. My name's Grace. And as TJ was kind enough to introduce, I'm going to give you a brief overview of the results of the report that the Elections Group and BPC just put out on training for election officials, a 50-state analysis. So a little bit about BPC. I work on our elections project, and what we do over the elections project is develop and advance durable bipartisan policy solutions to create secure, accessible, and trustworthy elections. And the way that we do this is we convene election officials to develop policy solutions that are practitioner-informed and pragmatic. Thank you to Isaac for plugging some of the ways in which we do that through our task force of elections. And then we advance those policy solutions through state and federal advocacy. Aside from the task force, the key way we do this is through our Election Workforce Advisory Council. In October of 2023, the Elections Group and BPC's Elections Project convened this group of researchers and practitioners and training professionals and association leaders to work together to innovate recruitment, retention, and training in the elections space. On the docket for 2025, we have new products related to recruitment, turnover, and professionalization. So keep an eye out for those as the year progresses. And this training report is the first Election Workforce Advisory Council endorsed report. So and again, an enormous thank you to all of our members for their dedication, their time, their commitment. And we're really ready and excited to get into it. So I'm going to walk you first through the recommendations. We offered 5, and these are basically just things that we think every training program should do. So I'm not going to go through them all, detail by detail. I'll pop into a couple that are most interesting and relevant. But we offer 5 sort of really high level things that we think every state that is innovating a training program, maybe developing a training program for the first time, should be able to do. The first of these, most states meet our top 2 recommendations, which are just, your basic, have a training program, make it available to as many people as possible. And then fewer states meet our more specific recommendations about what kind of training should be offered and to who. But again, we see a lot of really interesting models in these states. There are a lot of really good and interesting, options to work with here. TJ, thank you for dropping the report in the chat. So we're going to start with that top level number. 43 states have training programs. So these are training programs at the state level. Some state entity, be it your Secretary of State's office, state board, association, maybe a university, run a training of some sort that is available to local election officials within that state. This is 43 states. DC does not have a training program, so it is actually 43 states. And I'll show you the map. Everybody take a moment and find your state. And this is really good news. Most states do train their election officials in some sort of systematic capacity. And of the states that don't, there are definitely movements among a couple of those states to, start thinking about training in a more, again, systematic way. The other top line number is that 42 of those 43 states allow staff members to attend training. Sorry, Mississippi. And we found through our research that permitting deputies and staff members to attend training is important both for continuity of operations reasons, right? Making sure that there's always someone in the office who knows exactly what needs to be done, but also for professional development for those staff members, right? Chief election officials really benefit from training because it's an opportunity to get together with their colleagues and their peers and learn from each other and improve their professional development. That's also important for staff and for deputies, especially if they're going to run the office one day. So again, 42 of the 43 states with training open it to deputies and staff, which is a really, really good finding. We're now going to turn to some of the considerations. So the thing about elections that y'all know is that there is no one size fits all best approach. We have some areas where there are best practices, but a lot of things are just, there are 6 really good options or 3 really good options, different ways to do something, and every state needs to pick the approach that's going to work best for that state. There are a lot of really good models, and they all look really different. So instead of trying to, pick and choose what might work best for some states, we just presented these as a set of 6 considerations. These are basically just questions that we have found through our research that it is important for election officials, practitioners, trainers to consider when they're developing a training program or trying to innovate a training program. And I'm going to run through a couple, again, of the high-level findings that I thought were particularly interesting from the research having to do with these considerations. So the first is that 27 states conduct a combination of online and in-person training. Again, here's your map. 4 states do all of their training virtually. 12 states do all of their training in person, and then the rest do some kind of combination of both. And again, different states have different situations, different circumstances, and there is no best way to do this. There's no one particular way that every state should do, but these are the options available. I'll take you through a couple of examples. I picked Arizona and Utah because they're geographically pretty similar, but they take really different approaches to this question. So Arizona, basically they require training. You have to do 40 hours for your initial certification, and then you have to do a couple days of training every other year to keep that certification. And they have a hybrid approach. They do 2 days of online asynchronous video modules. That's your standard PowerPoints, just getting everybody up to speed, making sure everybody's on the same page about the basics of laws, policy, and procedure. Then they do 3 days of in-person training, and this is much more hands-on. So this is your tabletop exercises, your opportunities to workshop, to actually try and practice things. And at least in the last couple of years, they've done those in-person trainings across the state. So they'll hold, some 3 or 4 trainings, and then you just attend the one that's closest to you. And this approach really works for them because it means that folks have the opportunity to, get all of that basic stuff out of the way, but then they can attend the in-person training and make the most of that time. Utah takes a really different approach. So their training is a partnership with Weber State University. And so because they have access to that university and that infrastructure there, they actually hold all of their trainings on site at the university. And it's a 10-class certification program. They offer 3 2-class sessions every year. So a couple times a year over the course of a couple years, the county election official and their most senior employee, both of whom are required to take the training, trek out to Weber State University, and they get some of the professors, the faculty, help teach the classes. They have the infrastructure and the physical space of an actual university to do that training in. And again, it's a really different approach than Arizona takes, but it's what works for the state of Utah. So I'm going to go through one more. Weber State, not Weber State. See, I'm a political scientist, so my first instinct was Weber State, but I knew that could not possibly be correct. I'm glad Mitchell's laughing at least. Somebody knows what I'm talking about. Okay, so we're going to do one more of the considerations that, again, I thought was most interesting. And this is that 27 states require training for local election officials. They have some law or policy on the books somewhere that stipulates that election officials must receive training. Some of these are more specific than others. Some just say they need to be trained, and some have, hour requirements or number of class requirements. Some of them get really specific. Again, here's your map. So 27 states require training. 3 have an incentivization structure. All of those are pretty interesting. And then in the rest of the states, training is not required. It's just optional. Again, I'll give you a minute to find your state. And we're going to do 2 more case studies. The first is Washington State, which is an interesting one because they actually require 2 election administrators in every county to be certified. This actually comes out of their 2004 election. So for those of you who've been around for a while, I'm told it was a particularly complicated election to administer. They had a really close statewide race. And one of the reforms they made in the wake of that election was requiring training for the election officials, but 2 administrators per county. Again, you see the importance for things like continuity of operations. So they have an Elections 101 course and then an exam. You have to complete 40 training hours, and that could take any number of forms. And you actually have to serve 2 years in an election office. So they are a state that, got it together, convinced their legislature, required training. It also comes with some funding. So the local election officials in rural Washington aren't on the hook for all of that money to attend training. Missouri is one of those 3 states, on the other hand, that incentivizes training without requiring it. So election officials receive a $2,000 annual salary incentive to attend training. The training by law has to be approved by the County Clerks Association. The County Clerks Association actually runs the training too. And in smaller jurisdictions, this is vital, right? They need that $2,000. They just don't have the money to pay election officials really anymore. And so in larger counties, it's, maybe slightly less of an incentive because they're starting with a higher baseline salary, but it's still an important way to incentivize participation without actually mandating it. And again, there's no right or wrong approach here. As with all of the considerations, there are a menu of really good and interesting options, ways that states go about training their election officials, but they're important to think critically about what is going to work best for any particular state. So that's really all I have for you. I'll leave my contact information up on the slide. I write our newsletter, so if you want to hear more from me, subscribe to our newsletter, and you can always email me with any thoughts, ideas, questions. Otherwise, I am delighted to turn it back over to our panel.
Excellent. Thank you, Grace. Excellent work on the report. Going to jump into some questions, both for you, Grace, but also for Isaac and Mitchell. And I think my first question is, directed at Isaac and Mitchell, who both have experience either training election officials or being an election official. As you think about the recommendations and considerations from the report, which ones do you think are really the most impactful? Which considerations do you think are the most difficult to implement? I'm thinking about hybrid versus being all in person or online. So kind of throwing that to you, where would you start if you were going from scratch and building a training program?
You want to just call on whoever you want to start?
You go, Mitchell.
Okay. So first, thanks to Grace and for everybody involved in the report. This is again something near and dear to my heart, and I enjoyed talking with folks about it as this was being built. I think I agree with all of the recommendations in this report. They're all right on. I would say, having done state-based training for election officials at one point, that for the places who aren't doing it or who have nascent programs, sometimes this can be really political and very hard, and so paying attention to the political environment about the training programs is something that we don't think about a lot, but I think is pretty important. I also agree so much about everybody should be trained across organizations. One of the duties of leadership is stewardship, and that means always paying attention to who's coming up behind you. And I will say, though, on the recommendation for training for new election officials, I do think it's important to have that. I will say I think a lot of the really good training that happens is sometimes much more informal, and the peer-to-peer support that happens in some of the training classes where you have new people and experienced people is often more impactful than what you get from just sort of canned training. And so that'd be something I think about, a both and approach is how I would do that. I will also say that my favorite classes to teach in the Election Center SEER program are the renewal classes for the people who've been in it for a while. There's still always so much to learn and to dig deep on. And then the last thing I'll say, and I'm sure you'll hear me say this again as we're talking, is that on the evaluation part, evaluation feedback and continuous improvement is critical, but you have to do more than just subjective evaluation. You also have to include objective assessments, and this is really technical and hard to do, and so people don't do it.
I think one of the biggest challenges we've seen since 2020 is the next grouping of election officials that have emerged and the lack of succession planning I think we have seen in the industry. So part of my goals looking at our statewide association is how do we prepare the people that are in the offices that are staff, that are managers, that are even in entry level positions, how do we give them opportunities to advance within the profession? And I think a lot of the training has always been geared toward the nuts and bolts of election administration. So, how do you program your equipment? How do you register a voter? The ins and outs of how to use the software. There's a lot of that already exists, and quite honestly, the vendors could do that themselves. But a lot of states have just taken that part of the training and they're going to give you updates to what happened in legislation. But what's really lacking, where I found in this state of South Carolina, was the professional development of our election administrators. Because in South Carolina, all 46 counties have to use the same, everything's the same. We have to do the same thing. We're all appointed by, the directors are appointed by a board, but there's relationships, there's budget planning. There are things that really are not preparing you well if you just take the state's training. Or it's just very basic information, just kind of overview. So one of the things I really want to push for is the actual professional growth in this field. And I think Election Center does this, and I benefited greatly from this, is being with peers and be able to discuss a lot of the things and challenges that are pretty universal across this country. And then the hybrid approach, I thought COVID would really push this envelope, but it seems there's still general we don't really like the online approach. But in South Carolina, we have boards and they have to get trainings and they have full-time jobs. They're attorneys, they're doctors, they're real estate agents, and to get them to go 2 hours, 3 hours to drive to Columbia to do their training is difficult. And they're always giving me feedback like, I wish I could just do an online training. I really wish that's what I could do. And yes, they can do that, but they also have a requirement to an in-person training. So as we look at the bigger picture, I think the professional development and preparing, as Mitchell said, which is spot on, is looking at how we prepare the people that will be replacing us. And true leadership is that you want to equip your teams to continue to grow and give them that opportunity to grow. So it should not be just the directors or the department heads having access to the trainings. It should be the entire staff so they can get an understanding of how your role is and making sure we're good.
Isaac, I really like how you brought up the considerations that go into like what's the benefit of doing it hybrid, what's the benefit of doing it online. We've got a note in the chat or in the Q&A about how looking at Grace's map or looking at the report's map, it's not just the big states geographically that are doing it all online or doing hybrid. There are some good examples of small states or small geographically where online only is the option. So as you mentioned, I think there's a ton that goes into making that decision. So beyond just making that decision of how do you deliver the program, what are some of the biggest challenges? And this is for everybody, but we'll go to Mitchell first. What are some of the biggest challenges that as you look at state level training programs of implementing them? Is it funding? Is it interest among election officials? What are the biggest challenges, Mitchell?
I think funding is a really big part of it, but in part because one of the crucial things in any training program is not letting materials and approach go stale and constantly engaging in process improvements and content improvements and delivery improvements is expensive because it takes people time. And there are, as I've looked across the states and talked to people about their training programs, there are some states that do this better than other states. That's true for everywhere. But an underlying factor, the two big underlying factors from my perspective really are commitment to it and the amount of resources you have to devote to it. And that part of this for state-based training is absolutely critical.
Grace, in your conversations with folks across the country, what were those big impediments?
I mean, definitely Mitchell is right that both the resources and the commitment are really hard to, get sometimes. I think one thing I heard from a lot of folks was that they don't know how to teach, right? They're election officials. Often, if it's an association running the training, it's just election officials, or even if it's the Secretary of State's office, like they're people who are designing and running the training programs are not necessarily, college professors like Mitchell, for instance, or folks who have some sort of systematic training in how to educate adults. So I think a lot of folks have started to, especially at the Secretary of State level, hire out for experts in adult education, folks who actually are educated and trained on how to educate adults, how to actually build curricula. Those are just skills that election officials don't need to have in their day-to-day jobs, right? And so I think that's a big part of it, is just the nuts and bolts of designing a curriculum and training people in a way that'll make it stick with them is harder than people give it credit for.
Can I jump in here?
Yeah.
And I want to say something. Education is different than training. And one of the things, one recommendation that's come out over many years has been, well, just partner with a university, do that. They've got people that'll do that. So I'll say a couple of things. This is like, I don't want to be crazy here, but first, just approaching somebody in a political science department or a public administration department doesn't mean that you'll find somebody who understands election administration. And until very recently, like the last 5 to 10 years, the people doing election work in these departments, most of the time, thought they understood all parts of elections, and they didn't understand a thing about election administration. There are so many more people working in the election administration field now than there ever were in universities. But even if you have somebody who's an expert in election administration from a research perspective, that doesn't mean they're necessarily a trainer. And so there's this, and if you find somebody who is an expert in adult education, that doesn't mean they know anything about municipal governments or how elections are run. And so just saying, well, my problem, I'm going to solve this problem by partnering with my university, like that's not a solution to your problem. There's a lot of steps to partner with the university to create a robust training program. And so it's just a giant caution I always give because there's so much involved in this.
Yeah, I want to echo that real quick because we Mitchell's spot on, and that's kind of where the rub is because, and I'm only speak in a neutral state to our state because this is getting recorded. No, I'm just kidding. I'm just going to speak neutrally because with a lot of new election officials, so the state of South Carolina, they funded a training department and they have like a ton of new trainers with zero election experience. Zero. They've never conducted an election. And that's difficult. So, and then when we went to the Riley Center, which is at the College of Charleston here, we are partnering them with our state association. They're amazing because they work with local governments and they have a really awesome understanding of how governance is in South Carolina. However, they have very limited election knowledge. So and that's where this marriage that we have now is like we're kind of learning from each other and like providing all the information we have to give to them so they can be better equipped to teach and to train. And I just in this area for me, it's like when I first joined the industry, how did I learn best? When I first became elections director, I actually learned the best at Election Center because it was peer to peer. I learned a lot from the professors, awesome content, growth opportunities, but I learned a lot from the people that were wiser than me, who had amazing ideas or have gone through things. And there are things I had never even thought of that could improve elections that I heard from someone else. One of them was out using a hiring company for poll workers. And he went through an RFP. This is in Tarrant County, Texas. I'll never forget my first election experience. And it took me 3 years to get it off the ground, but I did it. But it started with that very basic conversation on a problem we all have is recruiting poll workers. And that was just down to earth, real life conversations. And that's really what the beauty of some of these training courses too are. You gather election officials together, and sometimes you will actually get a lot more from the class, from the participants, than sometimes, you'll get from the core content of the course.
I think that is an excellent advertisement for the election center. Mitchell, what do you think?
I wasn't paid for this, by the way. I wasn't paid to endorse, but I will say this. Election Center, Mitchell, has been one of the greatest professional growth experiences for my career, and it's the people and the belief in what it provides is what makes it happen. The cost barrier, that's the hardest part for, looking at the counties and small counties and things like that. But for me, that was something that immediately brought dividends to my professional development. And that's kind of what I wanted to do when I looked at our state. How can we bring those concepts the election center does? How can we make that, apply to 46 counties in South Carolina?
Yeah, our training model is built on this idea that the people doing the work are the experts, and the CIRA certification program, the first 12 classes at least, are built around, half of them are classic public administration principles that anybody needs to work in government applied specifically to elections. And the other half are about policy and law and development of that. But the whole training model is based off of these peer-to-peer exchanges. We were very reluctant to go to online training for that reason, and we dragged our feet about it, and the pandemic forced us. And we are so we started in 2020 really fast to do that, and we put the classes together in such a way to encourage peer-to-peer, even though it's online. I think it's fair to say that our first efforts were nascent and needed work. We are currently this year in our third redesign and redevelopment of all of our courses. And every time we do this, it's not only to update content, but to change the ways that we support peer-to-peer in the training, because we think it's so important.
Yeah, on the topic of the national programs like Election Center, like the Sarah program, I think of the Humphrey School as well. I think there's excellent programs at the national level. Obviously, Grace's report has shown there are both excellent programs at the state level, and there's room for growth as well at the state level. How do you, looking first at Mitchell, how do you create an environment where those two types of programs, the state programs and national programs like you run, are able to work together and be effective for election officials?
Yeah, well, the state programs need to focus on state issues and laws, right? And whether you're doing something technical in the state training programs or you're also embedding professional development into them, and I think you should be doing both, but they are state specific, and so the national programs are wonderful because what they give you is a perspective outside of your state, and learning and innovating within your own state context from other places is highly critical, and I think that's how you marry those two things together.
Isaac, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, that was perfectly summed up. And just to like echo, I really believe that going outside of your ecosystem, the state, in your county, to go national really opens your eyes. And that's why I encourage the election center to everybody, every new director in the state. And if you're able to send your staff, and part of that is like staff development too. And I've created a program within my office internally to have all our management team, my leadership team, go through and get certified, because I want to equip them to succeed. And you know what? The amount of roundtable discussions they've had at a national conference with their peers. These are people that are really caring about it. I think when you think about training programs, I think of people who want to better themselves, enrich their experience. And yes, there's mandated training, but to continue that, I really believe that people are trying to grow and professionalize this industry. And just, I'm thankful that we have some level of that at national level. My goal and hope is at the state level, especially the associations of election officials or clerks. And when they gather together, they really know what the struggle is. I mean, the counties and the municipalities, we live and breathe elections 24/7 and conducting them. And we know the challenges we're facing, and having the avenue to grow together, I think it pays pays for us to gather together, to grow together. And I know that Rachel right now is in Myrtle Beach at our conference, and she's seeing firsthand some of our new concepts we're doing. We're doing these training courses with the Riley Center, and I'm hearing overwhelming positive feedback from my association members seeing like this in action. Like, wow, this is the best content we've ever had before. And it's like, yes, that's what we want to hear. That's how we know it's working. We'll see what the survey results say. But anecdotally, I'm getting text messages from people saying this is great. So just want to say, like, we look at training in the future, I really believe state associations will play a vital role in that. And it will coexist with the election center, because it's like, hey, this is what we're doing in this state. But if you go national, you're going to learn and get so much great information that goes just outside of our context that you can bring here to make elections better in your own state.
That's phenomenal. I know I was at an election center thing last year, and I shared a table with one of your team members, Isaac, and had a wonderful conversation. So I think it's a testament to what the Election Center, provides for, and obviously a testament to how great your office is. Grace, any thoughts, both just based on conversations you've had with folks on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think Mitchell and Isaac are exactly right. I think the national and state stack really nicely because the national level is obviously critical, as Isaac was saying, to get to see other people's perspectives, right? To see what innovations you can bring to your own state, to share the innovations you have. But elections are run differently in every state. And so having that particular group of state peer-to-peer interactions, people tell me is really critical to the operation, right? The people who know exactly what you're going through because they are going through the exact same thing because they're 2 counties over, that kind of network of peers and that kind of training at that level of granularity has been really helpful to people. The notion that, they really do, I think, stack well. And I think they're both Mitchell and Isaac are totally right that having both of them is really important. And also want to echo Isaac's comment that the state associations are going to play a really important role in building both the, technical training aspects, but also that professional development side, right? Giving folks a opportunity to come together and to learn from each other and to develop as a community. I think the Election Center gives states a really fabulous model for how to build that association, that community of peers, and then leverage that to improve everybody's lives.
TJ, can I jump in about one thing? You mentioned vendors earlier, and I think one of the things that people ought to think about doing is coordinating their training with vendors in a way that's not just, and now the vendor's going to show us how to do something. But at one point, we were doing some state-based training, and we coordinated specifically with the vendors where we did the law and policy aspects and the professional development aspects. And we coordinated in advance on topics with the vendors, and we actually traveled around states so people didn't have to go far, so there weren't travel expenses, and would set up in extension offices, right? Because extension offices are there to be used by the community, and they're often free or very low cost, and would bring in equipment with us and set it up so people got the hands-on training that they needed that was coupled with the policy and law information they needed to be able to marry those things together, and being able to have positive training relationships that include vendors like that, I think is meaningful.
I'm going to jump in, Mitchell, share an example of exactly what you're talking about. I'm from Nebraska, and we all knew that this is going to have to come back to Nebraska in the end. So ES&S is headquartered there. And something that Nebraska's county clerks and Secretary of State's office do is they have ES&S do the technical, how to use an ES&S machine training for the new clerks, because that's just what they need to know, right? They need to know exactly how to use the piece of equipment. And it leaves the Secretary of State's office and the state association with time to do the more development-oriented, professionalism-oriented training. Yeah, I think Mitchell's exactly right. And it's a model that does exist.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point. I formerly worked in elections in Florida, and what vendors there and across the country would often do is set up user groups. So the Panhandle is a good example of, it's mostly smaller Florida counties. Big trainings in South Florida would be difficult for them to get to, but many of the vendors would have regional meetings, user group meetings, where those folks could come to a much closer, much less expensive place to get to and get that necessary training. And I would honestly say to any election officials on the call, if that's not something that you're doing or that's being offered through your vendors, then that's something that you could call for or something that you could organize pretty easily. I'm actually going to turn to the Q&A. This is early. If other folks have attended our elections group webinars, this is very early in our webinar to turn to it, but we've got a ton of questions. I encourage folks who are here, please put questions into the Q&A. The first one I'm going to turn to is whether or not anybody's thought about whether hands-on versus lecture, if one or the other is better, or if folks just have thoughts on that. And I'll go to Isaac first.
I think lecture is probably the driest form of training. And I say that because I have experienced it for a long time as an election official. And the reality is, I look at my peers and they're not paying attention. And this is where I think the election center does a great job. And this is another plug. I need to get endorsed here. I mean, I need some sort of something. But this is where the election center is really great, is that they intentionally put prompts in the middle of their teaching and training because it engages the room. As I said in this report, PowerPoint purgatory is a real thing, and the state of South Carolina has changed. But back when I first joined, there'd be 300 slides, in an 8:30 to 5 training class, and you get this printout of each slide, and it was really small. And honestly, they would then send you an assessment quiz that you had to pass. So it was really important that you paid attention. Yet it was really hard to do that. And then you take your breaks, and that was about it. So really want to push, like, if there is a lecture component, that there's engagement with the people in the room, whether that's breaking them up in small groups and having them tackle a project, which Lecture Center does, which is great, because it gives you the opportunity to put into practice what you're learning. Obviously, there's certain things that you have to learn, like the laws of the state, policies and procedures, and those can be dull and those can be boring. But there's a way to bring that out and make it interactive, especially when there's a bunch of new people in the industry who've never probably conducted an election in their life. So it's really important that you get that component of the hands-on interaction. And I really believe that, the best classes that I have ever been a part of have been the ones where discussions actually were probably, built in, and also then maybe went longer than was planned. But the instructor was like, no, we got to keep going with this. This is a really good discussion, and it's driving home the point of my entire lesson for today. So really want to say, mix it. Lecture's not bad. It's good. It serves a purpose, but it has to have a component of interaction with the people who are attending.
Mitchell?
Yeah, there are a lot of different techniques you can use, and sometimes you need some lecture. But to exactly what Isaac said, we do this on purpose. You stop, you do a think, pair, share. You break people into groups to do some problem-based learning. You give somebody a case study, and with a set of assignments from it, you engage in some kind of modified short tabletop, right? Something like that. There are a lot of different techniques to do that. One of the things that's been sort of ubiquitous in talking to people as I've watched training evolve in the field is, particularly with new people or when laws change. I keep hearing about training experiences where somebody stands up and like reads the law, and you're supposed to remember it, and that's horrifying, right? And there are all kinds of things that you can do, like give somebody all the law and a worksheet that they have to fill out together with somebody else to figure out with, here's a real case, a scenario that you're faced with. Which law do you need to, find it, and what does it say, and use that to help you figure out what your action's going to be. And so there are simple techniques like this to make doing something that can be really dry and terrible more engaging.
Grace, any thoughts there?
Yeah, I heard that a lot from folks, is that mixing, an engaging lecture style with more hands-on approaches is really beneficial. Sometimes you do just have to sit down and learn some dry things, but there are definitely, methods within training, as a profession, as a field, to make that kind of thing more engaging, and not just engaging, but memorable enough that people are actually going to retain the information, because that's, at the end of the day, the most important thing.
The teaching and learning people have been for a while using something called a flipped classroom. And the idea of a flipped classroom is you use classroom time to like dig deep, but it requires that everybody's actually read everything in advance. And And that sometimes is problematic. So I'm sorry I interrupted you, Isaac.
No, totally okay. I was going to point this to more of a even local level, which poll workers and training them. And what I have heard, and then some of how we reformed our training is to bring more hands-on to them instead of PowerPoint, because that's actually super easy to do because you're just like, oh, I'm just going to have a slideshow and this is what they do. But the retention of that information, if they're actually not doing or being like interactive with the presentation, will actually mean they forget how to do things. So I've really asked my training team and I said, hey, we need this a more hands-on experience. And in early voting, we're one of the I think we're probably the best in the state in early voting training because we get to prepare. We have multiple weeks, but we actually do like we break them up into small groups and we do interactive real life examples of things. We role play, we work through these things like real life things that will happen. And sometimes it's like the ridiculous, like a flat tire happens and you're like, that's not going to happen. And then, you did the preparation for the flat tire of transporting equipment and they're like, oh, that makes sense. Now I understand why we did that. Or you always bring the most like you get the most angry voter and you just berate the election official and just get mad and yell and it just helps prepare them for real life actual things that will happen, not theoretical, not this like, oh, here's the law, here's what you're supposed to do, but like real things like, hey, it's lightning outside. What are you going to do with curbside voting? What are you going to do for the voters that are standing out in line and it's downpour rain? Things that actually will occur, and then you role play that and you see how your teams actually react. And then a lot of laughing. It actually builds a team too. You go through a lot of this stuff, it will build the core team. And at the end of the day, I always tell people, it's like, we can teach you the law, we can teach you the policies and procedures, but I can't teach you to be a cohesive unit that gets along, that roots for each other, that builds each other up. I can't teach that, but we're going to simulate exercises and activities that will bring you all together to get that team environment feel. And that's on just a very local level of training poll workers and election workers.
I think that's a really interesting point because in many ways, election officials are adult educators, right? Some election officials have to train thousands of folks before an election, and I think that's a really interesting way to begin to think about like, here's how we train these folks. How can we do better training ourselves or training our colleagues? So I really appreciate that note, Isaac. One of the questions that we have in the Q&A, we've talked about how peer-to-peer learning is really important. Building a professional network is invaluable either at the state level or at the national level through organizations like the Election Center. But going back to that nuts and bolts stuff, how do you, or what is the best way of ensuring that folks are getting that information that they need? What does that look like? The person who asked this talks about Maine. They have over 400 clerks who do elections there. Elections are just one part of what they do. So Mitchell, looking at you first, what does that balancing act of making this good for the folks who've been doing this a long time, but also making it so that it covers those basics? What does that look like?
Yeah, so I don't know that I'll answer the question exactly, but what I will say is developmentally, people need different things at different points, right? And so we need to modify training materials and basically have different types of training and different types of materials available for different kinds of peoples and users. And so I'll give you an example. One of our current master students in our program here went to work last year for an election office. And this past semester, she did an independent study project with me because she was doing the training for the county she was working in. And what she wanted to see, their training program was pretty good, but she wanted to see for the new people, if they put together a series of videos that folks could go to after the training was over to reference when they forgot things. And if that improved the quality of their experience and their actions. And the reason I bring this up is because there's no one size fits all for all situations. And one of the things that we have to do is not only experiment with new ways, but systematically study whether they had an effect or not. And this is where working with program evaluators, which is how I got into all of this in the first place, because I used to be one, is really important, because it's not enough to just do it. You have to be able to measure whether you had an impact or not. And so she was able to do this, and it was an amazing project. And so, and she designed a training tool for new users, right? And so you have an established training program that's great, but it's not great for everybody. And how do we do that? So I don't know if I answered the question or not, but I'll stop talking.
Anybody else have thoughts on that one?
Potential way to plug two of the recommendations at once. No, I really think that having specific training for the new folks, especially in states that are experiencing high turnover, where you just don't have as much of that institutional knowledge, is really crucial, because you can do the professional development training over the course of a couple of years, but folks need to know how to run an election before they run an election. So, yeah, I think just having specific training and thinking critically about how to make that engaging and informative, and make sure folks are retaining that information is really important, because the things that are going to work for the folks who've been there for 10 years aren't going to work for the folks who are getting into this for the first time in their lives.
I think they have to coexist. I mean, obviously, you're going to have a lot of new election officials. They have to learn how to run elections, but they also have to learn how governance works, how it means to be I mean, I know in South Carolina, we have directors who have never been a director in any job role. They've never done anything like it before. So you have to equip them to succeed in like where they are in county government here, and you also got to have them succeed in conducting an election. And sometimes, and to be honest with you, this is kind of how the state, South Carolina, with all 46 counties, there's such a emphasis on the nuts and bolts that the other part kind of went to the wayside. So when we had people coming into positions, even promoted from within, they were kind of lost. I'll be honest with you, I had to learn a lot of things when I became director. I've been in the office for 6 years at that point, but there were so many things I didn't really understand. But the county actually had a leadership program that I loved so much, because it exposed me to all the inner workings of county government. So the reality is I have to be best friends with the facilities department, because they actually are taking care of the building where my equipment's being kept. And if I have an issue, I need their help, and I need to be able to effectively communicate my my wants and needs effectively. I have to be able to communicate that plain English, or I'll be. This is true story, is to get the county to understand that we're part of the critical infrastructure under Homeland Security. Like, elections are part of that. The facilities director doubted that. We had to pull up the report. We had to pull up everything and send it and say, see, we are this. And like, oh, but you got to be able to effectively communicate. You got to be able to know where that is. And that's one of the things, and this is a plug for BPC here. When y'all came to our mid-year conference and you taught the class, I had so many people come up to me afterwards and said, these reports, we've never had access before. We've never been able to articulate what the data shows. Y'all put all that data together and you gave all these analysis and recommendations. And now we can use that when we go to our county administrator or when we go to county council. And I think that's what's so effective, is when you get these training programs off the ground, you expose the weakness, but out of exposing the weakness, you actually are going to bring strength and repair to it, because they're going to be equipped to then go and do. And that's what I love about what we're seeing nationally, with more research, more things looking at the actual facts rather than maybe hearing the story or two. We actually now have facts. We now have the data that's being analyzed, and we're having recommendations that are coming from that. And I think that's really, really important. So there's my plug-in for BPC.
Look at you go. We'll have to get you an election center / BPC hat to wear on the next webinar. I think that'll be good. I really like your point about just the recognition across government of the importance of elections. I visited an office last year, and she was talking about the director was talking about being invited to the emergency management meeting or council meeting, whatever it was. And she gets there and someone looks at her and says, "What are you doing here?" And I think getting folks, both within government and outside government to recognize what a critical role elections play it's an ongoing task. It's something that I think the Election Center, BPC, and many others have done an excellent job of moving the ball forward. But I really like that. I think we're at almost at the end of the time, so I'm going to ask one last question. What is your advice? So we'll start with Grace. But if I'm an election official in a state that has no election program or no election training program, what is the first thing I should do? And we'll start with Grace.
Contact your association. This presumes that you all have an ample state association. So, if that's not the situation, then there are any number of resources. The Election Center is actually working on a project to build out, what a state association needs in order to be in a position where they can do things like run a training program. We're also doing some work around state association stuff, but start with your association, right? Start with your network of peers in the state. And then, as Isaac's been saying, if you can, start with your network of peers outside of the state. There are a lot of really, really good models in other states that are going to be fairly comparable to the situation your state is in, geographically and in terms of what kind of elections you run, your calendar, that kind of thing. So I think, you're not in it alone in as much as you've got this whole network of people in your own state. Hopefully you have an association that unites them, and you have a whole host of examples around the country of folks and associations and offices who have already done this and would be, I can tell you, beyond a shadow of a doubt, absolutely delighted to share their knowledge and their insights and their resources. The thing I heard over and over was that either people really wanted to know what other states were doing, or people, when they were starting their programs, just immediately went to their friends in other states and said, "What are you doing? And can I copy this?" And they said, "Yes, of course." So there's networks of people who are going to be your most valuable resources.
Right, that's excellent. Mitchell and Isaac, 60 seconds each. Mitchell.
I don't know that I can do this. Sure. The first thing that you should do after you've done exactly what Grace did is think about what your needs are for training and start there about what's first, and then build out the other fancy bells and whistles later.
Excellent. Isaac.
My elections group shout out now. So the elections group, the elections group actually has some great resources on statewide associations and how to hit the ground running with that. One of the things I would recommend is get your other colleagues together and do a whiteboard session, see what they need, and that can help build out the content and curriculum. So that way you're not, you might have the vision, or you might be like, we need this, but then what you're offering is not at all what, would get the most buy-in from. So meet with your peers, their colleagues, and do a whiteboard session and see what they want to see out of trainings in the state.
All right. Thank you. All right. We are at the end of our time together. Thank you, everybody, for joining us for another Elections Group webinar. Thank you, Grace. Thank you, Mitchell. Thank you, Isaac. We'll share tons of resources in an email that will follow this webinar. I hope everybody has a great afternoon or great rest of the morning, depending on where you are. And we look forward to seeing you again soon.